I saw a documentary a few years ago about Chernobyl, and it was about what happened in the months, years really, post-Chernobyl, to the actual land, to the villages and towns and forests around that area of the world. And what I found like so moving and powerful was the way nature, the wild, the wilderness was doing whatever the nature, wild, and wilderness does, with no human intervention at all. So here you have, of course there have been several now, but one of the worst environmental tragedies of the modern era, which is basically the only era where you can have environmental tragedies, at least on this scale, and then just the wild world left to itself. And you got to see what happened to houses with no inhabitants, and to streets with no maintenance, and to soccer stadiums just left to be alone, still. And I can remember now some very powerful images. One of them were the trees, the forest, growing up in the middle of a soccer field. You could still see sort of the remnants, the outline of the circle and the stands and the stadium. But what was winning was the forest. And one particular element of the documentary tracked the wolves. What has happened to wolves all over the globe is almost a total decimation. Once these wild and free creatures, these very tribal and communal and relational creatures, these wolves, which roamed almost everywhere on the globe, human beings, if we were to go back to the children's message and we were to hold up a little stuffed animal of a wolf, we'd all say, I don't know. I don't know if that is a good or a bad creature. By the way, this is a total aside, but there's something about the fierceness and wildness of a wolf that is very alluring and attractive. And I wonder sometimes if that's why we like our dogs so much. I mean, we prefer little toy dogs, little toy poodles, but if you look into that creature's eyes, there's something of the wild still left, even if we feed them like a gluten-free diet or something, you know? But one powerful thing about what was happening around the area of Chernobyl was the wolves had returned and were roaming wild and free as they always had. Now, that's not to say there wasn't also great harm, because the forest was sick and the wolves were sick, and there was a sickness left over from our glut and greed for power. But nevertheless, nature was winning. And we started like this 3-week conversation with a line from Gary Snyder. To speak of wilderness is to speak of wholeness. And that was what was so powerful about this documentary. There was a kind of wholeness coming back to life again. And human beings came out of that wholeness. We came out of this relationship with the wild. So, I was thinking about this documentary. I was thinking about it as a kind of metaphor for modern life. Even nuclear science and its aftermath is a kind of metaphor for contemporary life. If you take our ability to peer into the mysteries of the atom and to do with it as we please, which we're able to do with science, we would all agree, for what benefit? Well, some of it is for war, and some of it is to keep the lights on. But the thing with nuclear science is that we don't know what to do with the poison. We don't know what to do with it. We put it in the ground. We bury it. And we cover it up. There are places in the United States, the size of Rhode Island, where we keep nuclear waste underground in parts of the Southwest and in Washington State. We cover up and bury what we don't know what to do with, so that we can maintain, really, the illusion that life is fine and good. Why is it fine and good? Because my phone works, you know? And because I can drive in my car on the way here. And except every once in a while, it's going to come back and bite us. Like Chernobyl, like what happened in Japan. And you think that that's just going to go away. That's part of the illusion. We think, well, we'll figure out another technology to fix the fact that we don't know what to do with this waste. Now, here's why I was thinking about it as a metaphor, because those are just facts. The same tends to be true with our own psychic life. We tend to seal off what's underground, what we don't want to look at. And we put out a pretty picture on the front. We call that Facebook. And part of what I want to have a conversation with this morning is, how do we begin a conversation with not only what we've sealed off, but the wildness that is beneath the surface? Because where we have wildness, we also have wholeness. Now, it's interesting. As soon as I say something like there is an instinctual self, we want to immediately go to fight, flight, fear, sex, instincts like that. But there are plenty of other instincts. The human being is a complicated mystery. Some of the oldest artifacts, or artifacts might not be the best word for it, but one of the oldest expressions we have of cave people is from 10,000 years ago in a cave in France. And you know what's in there? Paintings. Art. In other words, something about our instinctual and wild self is in conversation with beauty and art and craft and meaning and relationship, in addition to fight or flight and our fears and our survival mechanisms. And I mentioned last week, it's worth repeating, that Darwin wasn't just saying survival of the fittest, he was saying survival of those who are most able to fit in. There is a huge difference. In other words, there's a relational component to the survival mechanisms, which means even from even from the perspective of biological evolution, it's not dog eat dog. It's dog cooperate with dog. Now, that doesn't mean everything's pretty. It is a bit messy. Nature is messy. Even if we pretty it up at a place like Meyer Gardens, which I like. Let that thing go, and what's it going to look like in 40 years? That would be an interesting experiment. Okay, that was my intro. What I want to do this morning is something a bit unusual. I want to share two myths. And I can't help it. I'll provide some commentary. If I was very disciplined, I'd just tell the myths and walk off the stage and be like, what was that? But I'll provide a little bit of commentary. And I want to provide these two myths. One is more male in its orientation. It's probably having a more masculine conversation. The other is more feminine. Because part of what I want to explore today, and part of what's missing in the world, is what I would call a relationship with the wild self, with the green man or the green woman, as they're called in mythology, with this wild, instinctual part of our masculinity and our femininity. And we don't need to think totally one or the other. I mean, Jung, after all, provided us a very nuanced map of what the inner landscape is like, saying things like, within each person you have the anima and the animus, meaning the masculine and the feminine. The ancient people knew about these things, and they put them in stories because they recognized something, and this is what they recognized. If we want to grow up in a healthy way, meaning also having healthy cultures, in healthy right relationship with the natural world, we need to grow up with much more sacred images of the masculine and the feminine. And the reason why that's so important right now in 17, turn on the freaking news if you don't believe me that we have very underdeveloped images of the masculine and the feminine. And we've lost the ability to tell stories that awaken this deeper sense of what it means to be a human being and the more wild sense of what it means to be a human being. So here's the first one. And I'll tell only 10% of it. So there was a king. And he's a pretty good king. And his kingdom was on the edge of a forest. And wanting to be a good king, he wanted to provide meat for his people to eat so they could, live a vibrant, healthy life. So he'd send hunters out into the forest to hunt for meat, for game. And what people begin to recognize is that these hunters who went out into the forest stopped returning. They just didn't come back. And pretty soon the king got the message. Send people into the forest, send people into the wild, and they're not going to return. So therefore, seal off the forest. No one is allowed to go into the forest because our hunters do not come back. So this goes on for some time until a stranger shows up, a hunter himself, with his dog, and starts asking questions. How come there's no meat? And they say, well, because we don't go into the forest. Our hunters don't return. He's like, well, I'm not afraid. I'll go into the forest. I'll find whatever the issue is. What's the big deal? He has an argument with the king. The king says, fine. He takes his dog, goes into the forest. And he goes deep into the forest, over little creeks and trees and deeper, until he's walking along the edge of the pond, and just out of the corner of his eye, deep in the forest, out from the pond comes a naked arm that snatches his dog, takes him down under the water. So the hunter freaks out a little bit, goes back to the village, gets 3 friends, says, bring a bucket, we're going into the forest, we're going to find my dog. Sure enough, they go into the forest, and bucket by bucket, they start emptying out the pond. It's kind of a muddy pond, a mucky pond. They're emptying it, and this takes time. It takes months, in fact, more and more bucketing until something starts to move at the bottom of the pond, and what emerges is a wild, hairy man. You can't actually tell the difference between his hair and the bottom of the mucky pond itself. And he's got a beard, and he's rusty in color, and he doesn't say much. And the 4 men really think to themselves, let's tie him up. Let's tie up the wild man, and we'll bring him back into the village. That's what they do. They tie him up, they bring him back into the village. And they put him in a cage. Say, we've done it. We've captured the forest, or we've captured the wild man from the forest. It's safe to go out and hunt. Now no one is to go near the cave, and the king issues an edict. No one let the wild man out of the cage. One day his son, maybe he's just a boy. I don't know. He's 8, he's 10. He's playing with this golden ball of his that he got from his father. And he drops it and rolls into the cage. And the boy says, give it to me, wild man. Wild man says, sure, I'll give it to you. Just let me out of the cage. Boy says, I can't. There's a rule that nobody can let you out of the cage. And plus, I don't know where the key is. And the wild man says, I know where the key is. It's under your mother's pillow. This is before Freud, by the way. So the boy gets up the courage and one day steals the key from underneath his mother's pillow, opens the cage door, pinches his finger in the process, and the wild man's out of the cage. And he heads back to the forest, and all of a sudden the boy realizes, I'm going to be punished for this. He says, wait, I can't go back home because I'll be punished by my mother and my father. Help me. The wild man says, I'll help you, but you can never go back home again. Boy says, fine. With the golden ball in his hand and his pinched finger, climbs on the back of the wild man and heads into the forest. Okay? This is story number 1. Yes, you might be thinking to yourself, what is this guy talking about? Which is precisely the point. The way myths work is that something in you recognizes something in the story, especially if you can let go of your strategic mind for a minute. What do you connect with? What do you resonate with? What do you hear? What's true in your own life? What do you hear in this story? What does your soul hear in this story that your mind has a hard time computing? So it's a story about masculinity. It's a story about discovering the wild man in the forest, which takes a lot of work. Because we prefer, especially in our culture, a nice, cleaned up and pretty kingdom. Who wants to go into the forest? It takes a lot of work. And actually, if you get to the forest, you're going to have to buck it out bit by bit. In other words, you're going to have to look at the dark stuff, the hard stuff, do the hard work to buck it out bit by bit, this wild, instinctual, and creative being at the very bottom of your psyche. And once he comes out of hiding, you're going to think, oh crap. What's going to happen to my life if I listen to this wild, instinctual self? I better lock it in a cage. Which is what we do. And sometimes we lock it in a cage for so long we forget it's even there. And some little boy in us, one day, almost by accident, is playing with this golden object and it rolls in there. And this is the moment in a young person's life, of any age, I mean psychically, where you're given a kind of choice. If I want to hold in my hand the golden threads of my own life, in other words, if I want to give the gift of what it is to be me in the world, to discover my full capacities as a human being, I'm going to have to make a deal with the instinctual, wild, creative being at the very bottom of my psyche. It's fine if you don't, by the way. You can just have a normal life, which we would just call a boring life. And if you let this thing out of the cage, it's going to hurt. It's going to pinch your finger. It's going to wound you. And you're not going to be able to go back home. Mommy and daddy are going to be mad. The mommy and daddy in your psyche that wants you to be a good little boy in this story is not going to trust you anymore. Imagine if you were really good at the guitar. I don't know, try to imagine someone like this. But you were told you can't play the guitar that way. You can't play the guitar that way. You can't, hit it. That doesn't make any sense. And you're given a kind of choice at a certain point as the cycle and as the story unfolds. If I want to bring forth this golden object that's never been brought forth in the world before, I'm going to have to let this wild thing out of the cage, and it's going to hurt. It's going to hurt. And it's not going to look like it should look. And that's the beginning of growing up. But there's a little seed in this story about what I'm calling the sacred masculine. You do have to get close to the instinctual self, which instincts can go wildly astray, correct? But what's worse is when you lock them up, they're going to leak out sideways, like a nuclear waste facility. As long as I cover it up, it's going to be fine until one day it leaks and poisons everything. So the invitation in this sense for a kind of growth into sacred masculinity is to begin a relationship with this wild, instinctual, creative, hairy, rusty beast at the bottom of your psyche who can teach you the ways of the forest and give you back the golden object that you can bring forth in the world. Story number 2. There's a woman who lives in the forest. And she lives deep in the forest. In fact, very few people have ever seen this woman. In fact, some would even argue that there's no woman at all out there. Few people, almost by accident, almost by getting lost, have stumbled into this woman. Her name is La Loba. And she lives deep in the forest. And if you happen to be a bit lost one day and you stumble your way deep into the forest, and you happen to catch a glimpse of La Loba, this is what you'll see. You'll see a woman who's fat. She may have a few little hairs on her chin. She may actually, if you get close to her and you peer around the corner, maybe you're a little bit frightened, you look behind a tree, you'll see she has some warts. She also wears whatever she wants, whatever she finds on the forest floor, or she doesn't wear anything at all. Who cares? And she lives out there in the forest, deep in the forest. And what she does all day is collect bones. This bone collecting woman. In fact, one of her names is Bone Collector, or the Bone Woman, this La Loba figure who lives deep in the forest that few have ever seen. Maybe you've caught glimpses of her. I don't know. Maybe you have, maybe you haven't. Maybe you caught glimpses of her riding shotgun in a semi-truck one day. Maybe. Maybe you saw her carrying a bundle of sticks in the forest, and you thought, who is that? Maybe you saw her crossing the border from the United States to Mexico, going the wrong way. Who knows? Maybe you saw her riding her snowmobile to the bar in the UP. Who knows? I can't say for sure. So, what La Loba does all day is collect bones. Very painstakingly. She likes rattlesnake bones, definitely. Sometimes she'll collect the bones of a fox or a doe, but her favorite is to collect the bones of a wolf, which she takes great care to collect. And it takes a very long time to go around collecting these bones. In much the same way, it takes a long time to bucket out a pond. But in this case, La Loba goes around, checks valleys and canyons and wadis and mountaintops and in caves and under trees, collecting bones bit by bit by bit. And she brings them back to her cave in the middle of the forest, and she places them on the ground. And then she goes back out to collect more, until one day, almost with no plan, just going about her business, she looks at the floor, and there's a complete skeleton of a wolf. And what she does at this point is sits down and lights a fire and thinks and waits. And what she's waiting for is a song, some song that comes up out of the heartbeat swirl of the earth itself, and she begins to sing. And as she sings, if you were to witness such a thing, and you were to notice on the floor, you'd see, sure enough, the bones begin to shudder a little bit and shake as she sings, as she belts forth this song. So she sings some more. And if you were to ever get so lucky as to see this sort of thing, you might even see the skeleton of the wolf stand up. And what would La Loba do? She would sing some more, until flesh began to form around these bones and hair began to grow. And that wolf began to shake her tail until one day La Loba's song rises up from the cave, and the wolf opens her eyes and she bolts. And if you were to witness such a thing, what you would see is this fierce female wolf running through the forest. And if you were to catch just the light just right, you'd see not just a wolf, but you'd see a woman running, cackling, laughing, hysterically wild and free. That's story number 2. It's a story I don't know that much about because I'm not a woman. It's a story about collecting up these solid bones that have been scattered to the winds. The parts of ourselves that are solid, that we can trust, sitting here or there, having once been together, but now they seem to be all over the place. It's a story about the painstaking work of La Loba, the bone woman, putting these things back together, A little bit of this self comes back into the cave. A little bit of this that was fragmented and broken and wounded comes back into the cave until one day the outline of a kind of resurrection is possible. It's a story about getting close enough to this wild woman, this La Loba, that you begin to hear the song of your own life. The song that only you can sing, much like the little golden toy that only the boy can bring forth in the world. Here, the woman has a song that only she can sing. And if she begins to sing this song, all of the broken and fragmented parts of her bone life that have been scattered by the world, by men, by children, by jobs, by pressures, by the frickin' internet, begin to move and shudder and shake, and some new wild creature, sacred feminine creature emerges and begins to laugh and sprint and run and dance. And you have the birth of the sacred feminine. Now, what does this have to do with our world? Well, on one level, without you and I beginning our own path back to the wild man, to the wild woman, to the green man, to the green woman, to the wolf. Without the journey back to that, we can't expect our family, our culture, and our world to have access to the kind of wholeness that I am just trying to describe and name. To speak of wilderness is to speak of wholeness. And human beings came out of that wholeness. If we live our life sealed off, then that's the kind of world we'll find ourselves in. The question becomes, for us, how do we make the perilous journey back to the wild? Back to the kind of inner wild life that all of the ancient stories seem to suggest is there. Well, how do you do it? Who can say? It's only a story. Thank you.